Chapter 1. Inside the Walls. There were creatures inside the walls, unseen and terrifying. They were not loud, but the noise they made was incessant, and it drove her to the edge of her mind. They were not mice. Traps for mice could be set to catch or poison them, so they would die in the walls of the house. The creatures ignored the poison, and the traps were dismantled. The wooden part was torn into strips, and the wire was bent like an accordion. No, this was much worse than mice. They followed her within the walls. When it was quiet, she could hear them whispering to each other. Were they talking about her? What were they saying? What did they want? Why did they watch? She didn't know what they were, but she hated them. Their sneakiness. The way they always knew where she was. The way she imagined they watched her as she slept. Spring seemed far away, though the calendar told her it would only be days. Cold winds were gusting furiously outside this ancient seaside cottage she called home. The chill seeped through the rags, stuffed in the cracks around the windows, that brought in wind and rain. She trembled as the cold stroked her skin. The rain crashed against the glass as if someone was tapping at the windows with his fingertips. The noise competed with the whispers inside the walls. Shuffles, whispers, tap, tap, tap. The sounds grated on her nerves as she worked. She didn't listen, but somehow the discordant sounds echoed inside her brain, making her tasks exceptionally exhausting. The walls of the kitchen bore the scars of random pots thrown angrily at the creatures. Nina turned her back on the window and held her hands toward the blaze nestled in a fireplace, blackened from a century of use. Little of the warmth reached farther than her fingertips. Today, the chill wouldn't leave her alone. Spring still seemed far away. Little sleep was had because of a full night of the creatures skittering. She yawned. There was no time to rest. Though she was young and strong, her chores weighed heavily on her shoulders. It was early, and already her back ached. She kept her mouth in a grim line, choosing first to gather wood for the fire. The wood would be damp, and it would take hours for it to dry. At least, gathering it now would take her away from the constant noise inside the walls. Once, not long ago, the chopping and gathering of wood had belonged to someone else. Now, there was only her. The wheel of an old rusted wheelbarrow limped along the grassy path to the woodpile like a drunk farmer. She stacked several layers of logs onto the wheelbarrow. Normally, she would have welcomed the chance to cut wood, but Nina was exceptionally exhausted and thankful she didn't have to do it today. It would have taken her all day just to chop and split enough to last 2 or 3 days at best. She was still learning to wield the axe, but she was learning quickly. Though she had no choice, she discovered it was something she enjoyed. This was work she loved, and she was proud of the growing strength in her arms. Swinging the axe had made her muscles hard since the weeks this job had been handed to her. Besides the chopping, lifting the wood was becoming easier, too, especially since she discovered that wearing her brother's trousers was far more comfortable than wearing her heavy skirts. Inside the cottage, she stacked the damp wood beside the hearth. She ignored the fire as she stacked it, knowing any weakness or longing to get warm would be a very bad thing. It would be too easy to fall asleep, she chided her stiff limbs. She had no time. Water had to be pumped from the well, and the first of the early spring cabbages and potatoes had to be planted, though the frost could make them inedible. Besides, if the old woman knew the chores weren't done, she would make Nina go out again in the evening to finish. Little of her day was her own, especially now. Always there was cleaning to be done, sweeping the old winter leaves and dirt from the floor when the wind brought them in. Laundry. There was always laundry. heavy loads of it waiting to be washed, bleached, starched, and dried. The ironing. It was a never-ending, thankless task, made even longer because the old woman had bartered with some of the merchants in town in exchange for their goods. And cooking. When she had time, she could create good, hearty dishes. Her mouth watered involuntarily. It was the middle of the afternoon before there had been any chance to sit and rest. A fine cabbage stew bubbled in the pot over the fire. Nina had wanted to make some bread to go with it, but there had been no time. Perhaps there would be time, though, for a taste of tea. Nina could hear the old lady upstairs moving around her room. It was a disgusting place, but she wouldn't let the girl near it with a waste can or cleaning rag, preferring to wallow in her messy familiarity, guarding her personal belongings like a treasure. This was the old woman's house. Because she was ancient and the girl had no place to call home, Nina cooked and cleaned for her food and lodging. Her brother used to live here with her. They had been alone, together since their parents went missing more than 2 years ago. She didn't like it now. With the absence of her brother, the creatures made her wary. She didn't know what they wanted. She wished she could ask her brother what to do. He'd always been the strong one. He was older by 4 years, much tougher than her, and he was so smart. She'd relied on him all of her 17 years. He'd been gone for more than a month, and she didn't know where to look for him. She lived in fear that he had followed the path of their parents.
"Nina!"
the old woman shouted. Nina could hear her stomping about with the uneven cadence of her heavy oak cane. She jumped at the strident note in the old woman's voice as her name was being called. Hurriedly, she pulled her fingers away from the warmth of the fire and dashed to the rickety steps. The house had seen better days. The worn planks creaked as she stepped nimbly up the stairs. This part of the house, the stairwell, with its closed walls and no windows to carry the smells away, stank of age and sweat and mold. Nina had tried more cleaners than she cared to think about, but to no avail. The old house reeked. The entire attic of the cottage had long ago been fixed up for the old woman's private bedroom. She rarely came down except on the infrequent occasions when the augur from the local ward stopped by to check on her. He never stayed long. His distaste of her was obvious, and she wasted no time returning to the isolation of her room. Nina often wondered if Miss Etty called for the augur just to rankle him. Like usual, the door to her room was open only a crack. Nina could feel the old woman's gaze as she peered at the girl through the slit. A thin waft of putrid air escaped from the room. Nina held her breath against the stench, saying nothing. The old woman was bad-tempered and difficult. No good would come from interrupting her thoughts. Finally, the old woman croaked,
"Everything is broken."